हाँ hey, can you hear me? For the last time. सुनाई दे रहा है? Testing 1 2 3 4. और cool. Hopefully this should work because this is unlisted, so unless one of you is complaining for some reason कि copyright है. चलो then I will try to start up. सब लोग को सुनाई दे रहा है ना? And all the questions that were there, I'll try to address them in the middle of the workshop. Is it buffering? चलो ठीक है फिर I'll start, okay? Because it's been a while. तो लोग hopefully आ जाएंगे जितने भी अभी नहीं आए हैं. एक बार ग्रुप पे डाल दे कि it started or whatever, क्षितिज or someone, whoever, जो भी रह पे यहाँ पे, अगर कोई है कि anyway, and yeah, I'm starting. So the little circle thing is there, but video and audio are fine regardless. अच्छा, okay. ठीक है, हाँ, तो then I'll try to start and maybe you can refresh or something if your loading वाला thing is happening. But हाँ, चलो. So in general, principles are like just these, like the Google definition will somewhat be like fundamental truths or something like that. Basically, some statements that can act as axioms that can then help back certain trains of thought or certain philosophies and stuff like that. So that means if you, for example, for utilitarianism, that's a philosophy or a school of thought. उसके लिए whatever its utility is will be, it's like the principle will be to enhance that utility as much as possible, whatever the utility is. It doesn't always have to be happiness, for example, but in a lot of cases it is like human happiness collectively. So in general, about what I'm going to try to do in this workshop is tell you exactly what principles are in debates, though, and where they come up, slash the various ways in which they do and which motions they become relevant in, how you argue them and how do you argue against them, and also this sort of uh, I'll try to discuss motions along the way. And if anyone has any questions, I will sometimes pause key questions and any. But even if I haven't paused yet, you can just ask any random questions. I'll be reading the chat throughout. तो अभी तक क्लियर है तो बस कोई yes लिख दो, just so that I know it's working, and then I'll start. Cool. So, yeah. So, what are they in debates? So here's the thing. Okay, to answer this question, you have to understand what debating is in general. It's like, so uh, regardless of however much you're told as a judge, for example, to be as rational as possible, uh, or like as stone cold in a way as possible. The nature of debating as an activity is one wherein you're trying to convince the judges or whoever that what you're saying is right, basically, and those people are at the end of the day human. That's not this might sound like I'm trying to say that principles aren't rational or aren't appealing to people who are trying to be rational. That's not my point. My point is principles are the type of arguments where you can actually, in a way, like appeal to the inner, like, heart, if you will, or like the heartstrings, or tug on their heartstrings or whatever of any debater, because everyone has some sort of like morality, and this is why morality comes in, because everyone has some sort of ideas of morality that they have been exposed to so far in their life and stuff, and then principles are principal arguments usually appeal to that sense of morality that makes a person then feel like what you're saying is probably right, it's just it's just the right thing to do, basically. And that's what they are in debates. In debates, principal arguments are arguments that say that do this because it's the right thing to do, basically, and proving that it's the right thing to do, not necessarily uh, sometimes based on consequences, but sometimes in a lot of times just based on ethically it's the right thing to do, because whatever that word means. And examples for this will be like, someone had asked if there are some basic principles that we can then argue other principles from. Sure, some basic principle ideas are like fairness, consent, equality, culpability, privacy, reparations, harm principle. Like harm principle is like the idea that your actions can only be limited insofar as they're actively harming someone else, which talks about when you are free to do certain things, or so when you are not. And like stuff like just war, which is like, what kind of war is just or justifiable, basically. Those are all again, these are all things you can read about, but they're also all based on very simple things, and all of them appeal to, when you read them as well, your own idea of what is the right thing to do and shit like that. So if that's clear, then where they come up and various ways in which, yeah, they come up in debates are basically, so you know how, and here's the thing, so you know how in debates you have a THBT or THR or whatever. Like THBT is like this house believes that, THW is this house will, THR is this house regrets, uh, and or भी होते हैं opposes, supports, stuff like that. So in a beliefs, usually in beliefs that motions, you often hear more principal argumentations than, let's say, in a will or a regrets motion. And the reason behind that is simple, that a lot of people think that in a believes that motion, principles are necessarily the only important thing, or like necessarily emphasized, because that's a rule of debating in a way. Ki, THBTA, so then you have to debate principle. That's not entirely true. And it's also because, I mean, even if you just play around with the English language, you can, like, you believe something simply because some good consequences will come out of it, not necessarily, even if it's not uh, the ultimately, like, ethically right thing to do and stuff like that. But yeah, for sure, in debates in general, THBT does mean that there is a certain emphasis or certain obligation, or if not obligation, then you'll just get brownie points, which is a weak term to use. But like, yeah, that usually those kind of motions involve like principal debates or principal arguments, or expect something along principles along the lines of principles. This house regrets in particular, and is and this is like debate jargon. It just usually is more consequential heavy, consequence heavy, because regrets usually means ki you as a gov side you have to show certain harms, uh, consequential harms because of which you are regretting something. And similarly for op, then you have to show benefits or like tackle harms or whatever, things like that. So those debates are usually more consequential. So that's something to keep in mind. So in a regrets motion, you probably can't just run a principle and expect to like win the debate. This house will is policy and stuff like that. Even there, consequences are important. But to say that, but even like to say that this house will in this house will motions you can't run principle is wrong, because or like they're not important is also not that uh, yeah, is not that correct as a statement, because yeah, this house will motions, and I'll get to some examples in which I've personally already like run principles and stuff in this house will motions in externals, and also that's also worked out. So and then that'll bring some clarity. But yeah, these are just general guidelines about where you should think about which type of arguments more. Can't we show principal harms in this house regrets? Sure, principal harms are, you can show them. I'll get to this question later because it addresses something very important, as what I feel is like a bit of a misconception when we talk about what principles are. It's linked to that other question of can we argue principles against consequences or stuff like that. But I'll get to that question later, Pakka. Supplement. So yeah, so what their use in debates is usually to supplement consequences. And like so usually what you do, the kind of arguments you have is that, oh yeah, so if we do this, it's a right thing to do, and also it'll also lead to certain good outcomes. So yeah, like they do often go hand in hand, and ideally you should in a debate have both arguments on your side, saying that yeah, these are the like this is the right thing to do for these principled reasons, and it'll also lead to these good outcomes, which is what a good case usually looks like. In like for example BPs, you would also have like principles can be extensions, like so basically some, if your opening has only talked about why doing something will only lead to good outcomes, and like in the opening half the debate has entirely been consequential, and it isn't really like clear for adjudicators or in the debate which side will take it there, then a principle justification that hey, if you do it because it's the right thing to do because of these reasons is completely like is a horizontal extension that could probably weigh the debate towards your side as a whole, and then maybe you could edge out your opening in that case or something. But to say that, but yeah, also to say that if your opening is already like established why it's a good thing, and like through consequences and stuff, you just simply saying also yeah, it's a good thing to do will probably not take it over them. But that's basically the idea. That's how extend principles are usually used, and I'll come to why they in isolation aren't as useful as arguments, not because of their nature, but also because of, and this is the answer to that previous question of this entire idea of principles and consequences going hand in hand, or principal harms or things like that. It's basically related to why principles exist to begin with, and what their relevance is in society, why they even exist. Yeah, basically. So I'll get to that later. But basically, these are the ways in which principal arguments are usually used. And isn't it immoral to value someone's consequences over others? Uh, Again, yeah. So, yeah, another way, like importance of principles is to like one useful tactic with principles is that you're able to just like explain exact burdens in debates, especially in beliefs that motions. You're able to the use of principles is to tell you exactly what extent of a solution consequentially is desirable. Which is to say that after you're able to establish exactly how much harm or benefit, harm has been done or benefit can be accrued through certain actions, which is why, and then justify why that delta benefit or harm is justified, and then validate certain actions that the motion is asking you to validate based on that principle. So it's good to, they're also useful to establish exactly what kind of burdens exist and why they are so stringent and stuff like that. So yeah, I'll just come to how to argue principles in general, and this is the main body of this entire workshop and why they're relevant, and everything will be explained in this. See, the basic idea is just 5 steps basically, like roughly. This is what, and to put it bluntly, it's somewhat like usually you have some sort of a principle. If you have, let's say, a principled motion, then what you'll try to do is see exactly what kind of other situations, what kind of principles you can first of all like break that motion down into, that these principles are what it's talking about, and then try to compare it to other situations usually that those same principles apply in or don't apply in, and then build your arguments off of that, because those other situations in which they're applied are often useful to explain or as analogies, or even to relate to the adjudicators in terms of why certain things are moral and certain things are not. So if that's, and then you have to just explain exactly why that principle, then if these two situations are similar or the same, why that principle should not be compromised, or those principles should not be compromised in this particular situation. Which is why, for example, in the trolley problem, if someone is arguing against pulling the lever, then the trolley problem basically is like, so you're at a lever where there are 5 people on one side, and the trolley is moving towards that, or moving currently on the trajectory to crush those 5 people, and you're at a lever where you can pull the lever, and that it will instead change tracks onto which where there's only one person, and then would you choose to then pull the lever, stuff like that. So if someone is arguing against pulling the lever, then a very as a thought experiment, it's a very easy thing usually, or it's a fun way to confuse people when you're saying that, hey, this is basically like taking someone off the streets and into a hospital, then cutting them up, giving like donating 5 of their organs to 5 other people who are right now in the hospital, who need those organs to survive. And then usually, even if people if by their intuitions think that pulling the lever is fine, they usually think doing the second, the entire idea of like kidnapping someone or whatever, and then forcibly cutting them up, they usually think that that is less morally correct, which is the entire idea behind appealing to their sense of morality and trying to like appeal to their intuitions towards your side. Which is why this is why I personally like principles, because it lets you be very imaginative, and the cleverer and more imaginative you can be in general, and thinking of examples like that, not saying that those examples will bring the debate, obviously not, but just to be able to see exactly where they apply is something that is fun to do in debates. uh, so yeah, the five, to break it down into like five, like an algorithm of how you argue this stuff is, first you first often you would want to change the metric of the debate, and because often a lot of debates have like utilitarian metrics. So firstly, what you try to do is you change the metric and try to give them examples as to why utilitarian metrics aren't always the best. And one way to do that is just say that, for example, if it's an economics motion, just say, and it's about taxation or something, and someone is if if for example, opposition is trying to argue about how uh, you somehow have a duty to, let's say, not taxation but anything, something like that, but how you have a duty to, like, if America has a duty to like help starving people in Africa or something like that, uh, you can say that, hey, if it's purely consequential, if whatever the motion is suggesting were to be looked at purely consequentially, you would. Acha, are there audio problems? I'll pause right now. Okay, so I think, Ramneet, you can just refresh and then I'll continue. Yeah, so basically, yeah, in that case, a gov could be like, see, if it were a purely utilitarian metric uh in all debates, then maybe what you would want to do right now is to simply tax a lot and then send all that money to Africa, and that will, utility wise, there'll be a lot of people who are just rid of poverty altogether and then can emancipate themselves and things like that. Utilitarianism would probably imply that, but you usually don't do that, or you usually think that that's not okay, because maybe people have a right to choose what they want to, or define their own utility rather than work for purely utilitarian metrics, by the idea of sovereignty and stuff like that. So, if you give examples like this in a debate, or that this idea that, okay, if I have like 1,000 rupees in my wallet, it's probably not okay for you to just steal those 1,000 from me and give to 10 beggars outside, even if it probably helps them more than the 1,000 rupees will help me. Uh, it's like things like that are probably not agreeable in the current society, and you would probably not want that to happen to you either. And the reason, and if that's true, if that statement is true, then you would then there would probably be some principle behind that statement being true. There would probably be some moral justification behind those things not being okay. And that all you have to do then is then explain to the adjudicators why that moral justification applies in this particular scenario, or at the very least why purely utilitarian metrics are not always uh, valid. Which is why, and if you just give examples like this, and this is like this works in basically any motion. If you want to, if you want to just take away utilitarianism as the obvious metric of the debate, because in a lot of judges' minds, it usually is the obvious metric. So yeah, these examples help, because then they're forced to question why they should actually listen to what you're saying. And these examples seem like slippery slope to a lot of judges. Yeah, sure. So the idea behind these examples is not that, again, that they will win you the debate. The idea is just to explain to adjudicators that it is at the very least possible in some scenarios to not have utilitarian metrics for every debate, meaning that this could probably be one of those debates. So just listen to our arguments is the point of this particular step. This is not an argument in itself. This is not like a huge part. It's just like the first 20 seconds that you need, if you feel you need them, to just get the adjudicators out of the utilitarian bubble, which you will often find is very important to do. And another thing that you can do then, is through your principles clarify why your stakeholder is more important, for example. So then this is about the burdens that I was talking about. Principles can, so even if two, three different groups are being harmed, or one group is being harmed more than the other, if your principles are able to explain to you why a particular party has a duty towards one of those groups over the others and should protect that particular group's interests over the others, even if the magnitude of harm to the other group is more, things like that are what can change the metrics of pure utilitarianism in an adjudicator's mind, which is useful to do in these cases. The second thing, once you've established that there can be a different metric to this debate, the second thing you want to do is to state what your principle is, obviously. So once you've given these analogies or these intuitions to them that, hey, look, these other things are not okay, right? So there's some principle. Then you state what principle you're defending exactly. You would want to, whatever it is, if it's consent or whatever, you would want to state that, hey, we think those examples don't work for this particular principle, and a similar principle probably applies here. Or if not those examples, like screw those examples, just we are think that there's a particular principle that applies in this particular motion. And then you move, once you've established that that's the principle, you have to do two things. First is give examples of other situations in which the same principle is upheld in society. And secondly, compare why. Actually, three things you have to do, because yeah, there's three steps after this. First is to give other examples of other situations in which the same principle is applicable. Secondly, compare those situations and explain why it's a similar situation. And thirdly, why upholding that principle in this particular instance is important. And this is important. I'll give you examples which will clarify this up completely in terms of how it's done. So there are some online debates that are really like great examples of doing exactly this, basically. Uh, but yeah, so I'll explain the last bit once you, because I think the giving examples of other situations, comparing the analogy, and explaining why it's the same situation is probably intuitive. But the final part is, in my opinion, the hardest in any principle argument, explaining why upholding that principle in this particular scenario is important. A good team that is arguing against a uh, principled argument will probably try to break it there, as to and explain to adjudicators why, even if that principle is valid, then it's very in this particular situation, it's probably not, or it's probably okay to not uphold that principle. Which is why this step is extremely hard, because that at that point what they're saying is that even if you buy everything they're saying on principle grounds, and this is the whole consequences and principle dichotomy that people often face. If an opposing team comes and tries to explain why in this particular situation it's okay to circumvent that principle or not, like not engage with that principle, then your principle in many ways stands irrelevant. And this is not unfair. And I'll explain to you why. And this is very important over here. Principles as a whole in society are only important or even relevant insofar as they bring about positive outcomes in that society. And here's why this is why all the previous questions of how can we argue principles against consequences and stuff like that are sort of missing the point of principles and their existence. And this is what I meant by when I said that I'll come back to those questions. Because the whole idea behind a principle or like upholding a principle in society is that in a large sense or in a different frame or in a larger perspective or something like that, you think that that principle leads to certain good outcomes in that society, which is why you would probably prefer a society that followed that principle usually. And note that that in itself is a consequence, because the idea here is that to say that like honesty is the best policy or things like that, just for no reason, like for no, with no long term perspective behind them, or with no like yeah, with basically no consequences associated with it, is something that is a very hard line to defend, and it's something that doesn't really make sense in my opinion. So if you look at, and at least in a debate, you will definitely not be able to uh, definitely not be able to make sense of it or explain exactly why that idea is even relevant. And like for example, the whole Kantian idea that okay, so truth should always be and this is a debatable bit, but here's the thing: this idea that truth should always be upheld in all situations. And so even if if a robber or someone who you know to be is a murderer or something like that asks you for, let's say, some X person's address, and you know that person's address, knowing full well that this person is going to harm them, and there is you don't know anything else, you would still give that address just because you want truth to prevail, is sort of a tough line to defend at face value. To say that truth at all points should be the most important utility and stuff is a tough line to defend, which is why principles aren't devoid of their consequences. Principles are only relevant insofar as they bring about good consequences in society on a large scale basis. So that's not to say that there is no defense of this particular Kantian idea, because you can see other things which I'll get to in a bit about why it's okay to do that. But the idea is simple: that you should not at any point think that principles are necessarily something that are some things that are again going against consequences, or things that don't work hand in hand with your consequences. The very idea behind principles is that upholding them leads to certain good outcomes which are desirable. Poor of the world wala is a debate that I want to show these guys. I don't know how to show videos here, but I'll do that. Wait, I'll pause and read the question so far. Can you share links of those debates? I will. That's cool. There's also so a lot of some parts of this workshop are based on my own experience. Some of them are like very and I found that it's really common with like I found a lot in common with this other workshop that I watched on the same topic. This I had watched like many months ago, but I remember that it was also very similar. That's why I like that workshop a lot, because a lot of the things that I'm saying right now had come through my own experience, but were all, the exact same things were also given in a structured way in that workshop. It's by Lucia or someone. Yeah, Lucia something. It's called Stop Sucking at Principles basically, and it's a good workshop. My like there'll be if you compare the two, you will find certain similarities, because and she does a great job at explaining it as well. The idea about in terms of exactly what you need to do is crystallized in a similar manner in that workshop as well. But anyway, I'll send those links. What is truth though? Isn't it itself highly subjective? Sure. I mean, okay, I can't answer like I said, like extremely deep questions like that. You have to be something more specific as to what doubt you have regarding truth. But yeah, sure, that's the whole point of debating philosophies in general, because there is no fixed metric as to what is good and stuff. And so that's why, yeah, so that's why it's fun. How do we prove it is morally wrong to distribute $1,000 from a rich guy's wallet to poor people? Uh, in many ways, I mean, you can say that a person might have worked for those for that money. You can say that even if they haven't worked, then there are consent issues. That stealing in itself is not okay, because stealing like stealing just feels wrong to people, and there's a mental toll that it takes on a person's like happiness and stuff like that, and it's not something the nice thing to do in that sense. Flipping it around, that it you can also say that it might normalize stealing in a society that is already based on spectrum, so that those poor people could steal from each other and things like that. I mean, and in that case there'll be uh, harmed a lot. See, the idea is just basically there are many ways in which you can argue that, but the fact that you probably, when I said that line, that you taking $1,000 from you and giving to the poor against your will, made you think inside, I hope that, hey, no, that's not an okay thing to do, is just the point of that line. It's not to prove it properly, but just to tell people that, hey, there are certain principles that you yourself agree with in status quo without this debate existing, which probably means there is a reason why you should actually listen to what we're saying. And this is only in the case where you're actually dealing against utility. I still maintain that in most cases you should try to argue principles right alongside consequences, because principles aren't at their essence devoid of consequences. um, can we argue that every person must have a right to liberty, so unjust for the society to take my money? Yeah, sure, things like that. Again, like there are many arguments that you can make, and all of those things that are coming to you intuitively are probably right things to do. The only thing you have to necessarily do then is, see, if that's the principle that you stated, then you if your principle is liberty or whatever, or uh, a right to property or whatever your principle is, then you just have to give an example of another situation, compare the analogy, and then explain why. And this again, that in this situation it should be upheld. Uh, so yeah, you could one way to do that last step, which is tough in this case, is to either say that a slippery slope argument, which is usually tough to do, slippery slopes that will lead to like what has been suggested, an anarchy state and stuff, because people can say that in for one particular instance it's fine to do whatever, which is in my opinion a very cheap way to dodge a principled argument. But to not let them get away with that is just to argue propensity, and where you can say that the moment you say these things, you're, for example, normalizing punishing others in ways that you probably would not be okay with yourself, meaning that you're lacking empathy, or you're increasing propensity. Even if it's not a slippery slope, you're increase in a society that doesn't value personal property as much, then you increase the propensity of crime in that society, meaning more people are unhappy at a large scale, because any the whole idea, and this is the justification behind honesty is the best policy, is that you have a nicer place to live in, because more people are honorable in that society, and that leads to probably a lesser chance of you getting robbed randomly, or a lesser chance of you uh, yeah, having just being wronged in general, which is why if someone is trying, which is why propensity in itself is a good strong argument that necessarily, in my experience at least, gets people to engage with your principles. Talk about why you can another reason why you can talk about to another way to explain why in this particular instance you should be upholding this principle is to talk about why this particular stakeholder that is involved in that particular instance is vulnerable, or is someone that should be prioritized. And you can do that through other arguments, like principal arguments or not. It's the same thing. I note that all of these things that I'm talking about are consequences, just in a different frame, like larger society, and maybe like a historic context framing that you give into the debate, stuff like that. That makes people believe you when you're saying that some like it should not purely be just who's been harmed more or stuff like that. Which is why it's like thinking about all these things is fun, and that's the broad blueprint that I would say for a principled argument. If you need to, then you change the metric. If you see the adjudicators giving it solely on a utilitarian bias, then you can change the metric giving those examples. Otherwise, the main four steps are just stating a principle, coming up with analogies, uh, like it's not analogies, like giving examples of other situations in which the same principle is upheld, explaining why this is similar to those situations, and then why in this particular instance that principle should be upheld once you've um, established established that this is a similar situation. So like we did a debate right now, like even in this tournament, like sure I would know this, about how this house will grant citizenship to all artificial intelligence basically. The debate was about how the context was a bit along the lines of sentience, sorry. um, uh, Wait, it feels like you're saying the only way to run principles in a debate is through showing slippery slopes. No, no, not really. See, that's the thing. No, I said one way is where you can do slippery slopes. Another is where you can argue propensities. Third is where you can argue stakeholders in terms of saying that why this person is more important and should be valued more. Fourth is that you can also say that through principles, through historic context or whatever, that a certain debt is owed to a certain group, for example, or a certain stakeholder in the debate, which requires certain actions, failing short of which nothing can suffice. In which case, certain set of actions are the only course of action that you should take, or the most relevant one, even if it doesn't lead to good outcomes for everyone and stuff like that, if that makes sense. I'll give an example. I mean, the whole Bo speech is a clear example of all of this only. It's a very famous debate for those who don't know it. It was one of the most memed debates ever. But yeah, I'll try to send the link, Abhi, and if you guys can watch it. Otherwise, yeah, I'll get back to that speech in a bit. Isn't deontology justified using long term the idea of maximizing long term utility only? Sure. Yeah, sure. And in my opinion, especially in debates, at least, it's not. And this is a question that that I myself like asked so many seniors in my own first and second year, and it never got a conclusive answer on, or a good answer at least, or any answer at all. Actually, none of them. But and from what I read after that, and from what I saw, is just that yeah, and this is why I came to this conclusion. Again, this conclusion of saying that principles aren't devoid of consequences. It's linked to exactly this question, this idea that not only long term, but just a different term, like a different framing, a different context in which, or a different stakeholder that you're prioritizing, and their utility then, or their their utility then is something that you're maximizing, is what deontology, at least in debates, has come to become for me. The idea that you you don't look for the maximum good for the maximum amount of people. You explain through principles why certain actions are more justified, or you explain through principles why certain groups deserve something more, a lot more than others. Which is why even if a lot of people are getting a lot more people are getting harmed through a particular action, it's still okay to do it. And all of the reasonings behind that are all principled, which is why at face value they might look like they're against consequences, but in real idea is just that consequences, the whole point is to prove that consequences for two different people are not always the same thing. And the only way you usually do that in debates is through principles, if that makes sense. How would you say that the rich guy is a more important stakeholder than five poor guys? You're condescending, so sure is what you are. Okay. Ignore what Shaurya is saying, but how do you prove that a rich guy is a more important stakeholder than five poor guys? Is um at face value, again, it seems tough, but um, in this scenario, I would probably go with those three, four things that I stated earlier. That there's a spectrum of society in which if you increase, if you become okay with like wronging some one particular person uh, uh, without really being okay with someone below you doing that to you, then you're probably lacking a lot of empathy. And like then it's like about why very a more empathetic society is like a better society and stuff like that. Um, Another is like not an anarchy argument, but just that idea of saying that the person like probably worked for it, so they deserve to have like probably have worked for it, so they deserve some amount of to be able to keep it, or to be able to donate it of their own consent. Why consent in general in society is important. These are all ideas that you can take up for how to say the rich guys are more important stakeholder than five poor guys. Of course, there's also alternatives and shit like that which you can argue. Which is why again, it's not only principles. You have to definitely try to supplement them with certain other solutions or ideas that uphold the same principle that you're talking about. Which is to say, if you can say while upholding these particular principles, you can still get to that end of, for example, helping those five poor people in some other mechanism, then you should definitely suggest that as well, because that makes sense in your principle justification. And so if your principle can bring about a similar outcome, then in the absence of that principle being engaged with, that principle will take the debate for you. uh, Anyway, so like the debate I was talking about was this house. It was around how a sentience in itself is debated. Let me just finish this and I'll answer that question about sentience in itself, how it's linked to or it's not understood basically well. And the motion just said, and this was, I think, the statement was something along the lines of grant full citizenship to all artificial intelligence, regardless of their level of sentience. And so at face value, it does seem like there is no, like, it sounds absurd basically, and it sounds ridiculous to argue because in general, again, I'll answer all these questions in a bit. Let me just finish this example. Maybe that'll make things clear. Uh, so there, the idea was that yes, you'll grant full citizenship regardless of level of sentience, whatever that means, to all artificial intelligence. Now, at face value, that seems pretty absurd because, like, you don't even know what that means in terms of what that world looks like, and why. Then again, for a principle, for you to make any principled argumentation that is devoid of consequences would probably be tough to take in, and would probably not make sense in that debate, or it would just make it tougher for you. And so we won that debate as Gov. And what we said, again, like, we didn't have the best of opposition either, but I think our case was pretty sound in that what we basically tried to argue, and this is the principle that is applied in many different debates, that I at least have applied in many different debates, and it works. This idea is that not the first half of what I'm going to say. The first half is to prove that sentience in itself is not understood. But basically, what we did in that debate, I'm not going to get into the full details. Through certain examples and of other thought experiments that we knew of, we explained why artificial intelligence can be has the potential to be sentient, and if it doesn't, at the very least, we as humans cannot define sentience. So we don't really know what sentience is at all. And at that stage, we can definitely not rule out the possibility of AI being sentient. And for any logical reason or for whatever evidence we have so far, if anything, AI probably is sentient, is what we proved through different analysis of like other thought experiments and stuff like that. Once we did that, what we had to do was explain why sentience is the fair metric for citizenship, because that's again what the motion was, that we will give citizenship to artificial intelligence regardless of their level of sentience. So that's the thing. We didn't really define what level of sentience is. We just said that they're probably all sentient to some degree, which we don't really know about. And in that scenario, we'll do full citizenship. And the question was why? Why is sentience a fair metric for citizenship? What we basically said was, or we tried to establish was, that in general, rights have been, and this is the, again, you'll see the consequence of this argument. Rights have historically been denied to different organisms by humans, or different individuals by humans, simply on this metric of saying that these people are not one of us, because we humans as a species have had like great ego saying that, oh yeah, we're so special because we feel emotions, obviously we're the only ones that can have free will and things like that, or if others don't, that they're not as smart or stuff like that. um which is speciesism in general. Like, speciesism as a is like the preference of one particular species over another species for an arbitrary reason, no real thought behind it. Like an example, and so here's what we did. Like, here's what I tried to do in that debate. In my first speech, I tried to give an example of this where this principle applies by saying that, so look, you don't and I'll also give examples that I didn't give in that debate, but I should have. uh, so, for example, you have an intelligent dog, like a pet, for example, or something, is probably a lot more intelligent. Sorry, a healthy dog is probably a lot more intelligent and sentient than, say, a patient of a human patient, a human dementia patient is in the hospital, who's maybe bedridden or something like that. But so because here's what usually was coming from the opposition. It was this idea of how uh, uh, from the government that basically this idea of why intelligence should be a criteria or whatever. The idea was simple, that no matter what metrics you decide, that dog is probably that dog probably fulfills those metrics better than a human does. The only difference between the two being uh, the only difference between those two being more sentient, sure. uh, the only difference between those two being that one is a human and one is a dog. And at that point, what we basically said was, to deny rights simply based on, and this is what we could have extended to. These are the examples that I didn't give, but I was sort of implicit in the argument that it applies to, say, denying women rights to vote back when men felt that they were simply not one of us, even though by all objective metrics they would have probably fulfilled whatever definitions they had of intelligence, sovereignty, whatever. Similarly, with slavery, when a lot of this simple skin color difference, that arbitrary difference of skin color was all it took to deny people rights. Uh, the point here was that none of these instances had a rational justification behind them, and all of them were oppressing a certain sentient being for no for simply for the reason that or for the ego that humans had, that for the powerful side had, that those guys just weren't one of us. And we said the point at which you're not able to give a solid reason as to why is not sentient is the point at which you're falling into that same rationale and being guilty of the same atrocities that you were then, or the same mentality. And that which is, and then I linked it to an empathy argument, saying that at all these stages, whenever we granted rights to certain individuals who we were oppressing, it was always a show of empathy and a realization that we're not that special, and these people do deserve certain things that we're not currently giving them access to. And that's why then I grounded it to saying that empathy, like our side grounded it to saying that empathy in itself is desirable in society because it leads to like lesser hate crimes and more acceptance, and it's a nicer place to live. Note that that's a consequence in this argument, but the principle was just that speciesism is invalid in general, and you should at all points be like a good, like you should at all points err on the side of caution, where if you, in this case where you're not sure about sentience. So the idea then is just that it's not a argument, it's a principled argument explaining why those people are like, why those people should deserve rights or whatever, simply because like explaining why sentience is a fair metric for citizenship, because by autonomy and like, yeah, you should be able to express yourself or whatever, oppression is unjustified, and it leads to, it's just a bad it just leaves people sad and stuff like that. But the consequence of that was that it's just more empathetic society, even amongst the humans, even if like AI, because again AI is only limited to access those rights based on its abilities. So if you give Alexa the right to vote, it won't start voting tomorrow. The idea is just that the consequential difference giving that right means is that you probably have a more empathetic society, which is a nicer place to live in. And this empathy or idea is valid in other debates as well. I'll give you some more examples. But this is why, like, that's what I've tried to what I've tried to elucidate here is just this idea of how principal argumentations work, and how even then giving consequences in and of themselves are important. Because if we, in the absence of grounding it with empathy, I don't think we would have taken that debate, because we don't, because the other side was trying to argue about all these negative consequences that might come out of, basically they argued a little weirdly, but they were just saying uh, ideas along how AI will, like dystopia basically, and we obviously tackle those as to why those won't come about, but we did have a consequence on our own side as well, which was in those cases important, which is why principled argumentations in and of themselves, unless the motion demands for it, and I'll give you examples of motions that are literally telling you that only argue principles, unless the motion demands for it, you will have to supplement it with consequences. I'll read questions now. In your case, why do you want to grant them citizenship? Won't providing certain legislative protection be enough? Like animal rights but exist, but we still don't give them citizenship. Sure. At that point, we would have said that if for example this is the case, the again the difference between giving them citizenship and giving like animal rights is pretty semantic in terms of citizenship. Or if you're defining in terms of voting, those guys probably won't vote anyway. So again, the whole access to rights argument. I, as of now, like you can point it out in comments if I'm missing something. I don't see a lot of difference between like a good implementation of animal rights and what anything less than voting for a citizenship is. For as in, for example, and this is another motion in which this works is this house regrets non-vegetarianism, and this is for a lot of people a very tough debate to do. In comments, if you guys want, I'll read other questions in the meanwhile. This house regrets non-vegetarianism. What gov ideas do you have? Why would you regret non-vegetarianism? Also, if nobody is writing anything, to bata dena. Then I'll move on anyway. Right now, I'm just waiting for people to write. Conversions, how much in fact, in that world, donations and tax make up for it. Okay, these aren't really questions, but they're you guys are discussing amongst yourselves. हाँ ठीक है मतलब अभी I won't comment on that. I'll get back to that later. But हाँ, so let's look at arguments. Unjustified to kill any living being, environmental change, disease, torture of animals, corona, morally incorrect to take the life of a sentient being for eating it, nutrients can be gained by veg. Sure. Okay. So listen. So you see, even in these arguments that you've given, all these intuitions that we get initially, so you can clearly distinguish the ones that are consequential, the ones that say that environmental damage, which is a very real concern of non-vegetarianism, completely valid, but it's a pure consequential argument that and anthropocentric. Anthropocentric means damage to us in a way. I'll tell you why environmental damage is usually anthropocentric damage, which is to say damage only damaging humans at its core as an argument. Disease, same thing, yeah. Look at this one: unjustified to kill any living being, and someone saying torture of animals, morally incorrect to take the life of a sentient being for eating it. Uh, yeah, these three things are definitely some things that can be asked at face value, like why or who cares or why should at least humans care about it. And at that point, if consequentially humans can't care about it, then you really only have to argue principles and those why those principles are important to have in society and stuff like that. So in this, let's see, look at nutrients can be gained by veg. That's definitely a consequential thing. Slaughterhouses, yeah, same thing. Uh, yeah, okay. Anyway, so the idea here is simple, right? So why would it be unjustified to kill any living being? What's so important about keeping animals alive in particular? Why is torture of animals bad? Stuff like that. May morally incorrect to take the life. So wait, all these ideas now. The simple this is why those questions are hard to answer because at face value, if the team you're debating against just comes up and says that hey, look, as humans, this house is a rational human beings does not care about the torture of animals because I mean it's not harming us in any way, then there's very little to say that in terms of against that in terms of consequences, unless what you talk about is in this case saying that historic comparing it to different situations about how initially the way you used to think about slavery was the exact same mentality where there was no rational justification as to why those people aren't one of us and stuff. Like for example, right now the point is that right now the line is humans and animals, but earlier it used to be female and male. Before that, it used to be black and white and stuff like that. And none of these lines were ever very justified to begin with. Which is, for example, and this is by that example of the dog and the that dementia patient is very relevant here, because in those situations you do prioritize the right. The dementia patient is granted all the rights a regular human would be, but a dog isn't. And then you can place the burden on the other side to explain exactly why. Because in the absence of that, in the absence of any justification, it's just feeding into the same sort of mentality that you had so far of being extremely cruel to people based on arbitrary reasons, which leads to, and this is what the core argument that I was once told about, or like behind regretting non-vegetarianism, and the one I feel is pretty strong, is that non-vegetarianism as a principle, or like as a mentality, is only justified through this exact same mentality that was culpable for all those other situations, and the one that still permeates in society right now in terms of modern day sexism or just uh, cruelty in general, because you are at all points less empathetic than you would be in a world where you accepted animals as equal, or animals as respected animals in general enough to not eat them. Not to say that you should grant them all the rights that you want and stuff like that based on whatever reasons that consequently that would not make sense. But the fact that you live in a society which respects animals a lot more probably means that that society respects individuals a lot more and is probably a more empathetic place to live in. Which is the same empathy idea, which is why I say I like that idea, because it translates in different motions. But the point is, it still remains the same, that there is a consequence attached to that principle of equality, or that principle of respecting life or whatever. And so what you can say as a regret, why you regret non-vegetarianism, is that you regret all forms in which this lack of empathy manifests in status quo, which is like religious lines where you have hate crimes and other ideas like that, like every other situation in which a lack of empathy, basically stealing from people and stuff like that, and all crime in general. And you regret that lack of empathy in all its forms and wherever it manifests. And one of the ways in which it manifests is this, that you regret non-vegetarianism. And this is why I love this question, which is coming. How do you argue op in this motion? Because at face value, everyone feels like there is no op to it, or like there is no gov to it, because obviously because obviously you would want to, if you get happiness and stuff, who cares about animals, stuff like that. But yeah, then the op would op although our op arguments at least are in my opinion pretty straightforward, because for at least from a non-vegetarian's perspective, because I mean, you can argue why it's again stakeholders, why humans are probably more important, why in this the same ideas. And here, yeah, so this is a good question actually. How this is what I want to address. How to argue against principles, which is my next idea. I'll come to Parth's question in a bit. Um, ये देखो. So what have I told you so far? Another question is coming up. I've told you that the way to argue principles is to state your principle, give examples of other situations in which that principle applies, compare why these two situations are the same thing, and then finally say why in this particular situation that principle should be upheld. So if that's the blueprint, how would you argue against a principle in general? If anyone can answer that, I'll wait for like a minute or something, a couple of minutes. How do you argue against a principle? What's the blueprint of arguing against a principle? This is if you the four steps are those steps: stating a principle, giving examples of other situations in which it applies, comparing why these two things are the exact same thing, these two situations, and finally why you should uphold that principle in this scenario. Can you guys think of a blueprint of how you would argue against a principle and that has been presented in such a way? Where can you attack that line of argumentation? Why is empathy so fundamental? I mean, so it's not the only argument. It's the argument that I think is strong, because empathy in general is, if you as an idea, is very powerful. Now you can see so many injustices that happen in the modern, like the modern world, that probably would go away with a little bit of empathy. Now, so it's just a strong idea in general to argue for, and it works. It definitely works, because in the absence of empathy is when you have uh, in the absence of empathy, you probably have a greater propensity for all crimes, or like all things that are hate fueled, or lesser engagement with people, lesser love in that world. They're all things that you can extend empathy to, in my opinion. So, which is why I like empathy as an idea, if that makes sense. If I argue, however controversial it might be, that we take just born kids and grow them as slaves and never let them realize that they're being wrong, make them feel that slavery is their purpose. Why is that wrong consequentially? Oh, that one is easy to argue against, in my opinion, because you can say that human beings are naturally, it's not only preconditioning, human beings are naturally uh, seeking freedom and stuff. You can't beat, if you beat it out of them, they're objectively very, very unhappy and sad. And that's a sadness that we don't want to inflict upon them because same empathy again and again. I mean, in general, that's, I think, there are many ways to prove by those people can't be happy in that scenario. Like this idea of saying that never let them realize that they're being wronged. You can, that the idea of that you're being wronged can come from within is uh, something I would argue against that line of argumentation. Can't we say that empathy in general is decreasing in regretting non-veg as we are now caring more about animals than people who should be valued more? And that's the thing. Why should people? Sure, yeah, that's a fair argument. But then you have to explain why people should be valued more. And that's where this debate lies. Then, yeah, why you should prioritize the needs of humans. So I don't think it's an unjustifiable stance. That's the thing. It is that these ideas that are initially tough to think of usually come up like this. Like this, that's how the principles work. When Indira Gandhi went. Also, is nobody answering the blueprint wala question? Because then I'll tell you where you usually argue against principles, how you usually do it. But yeah, where when Indira Gandhi went around forcefully sterilizing people, it was wrong morally, but consequentially a good thing. How do you argue both sides? Uh, I mean, okay, I need to be honest in terms of just history and stuff. I'm not like really good, but to say I would first, for example, not try to say that consequentially it was definitely a good thing. I would try to argue that there could be alternatives that were better and less morally wrong and stuff. Because that's and yeah, then say why you're being really cold-hearted when you don't think of or consider alternatives simply because this probably is a more convenient way to go about it or whatever. Um, but apart from that, yeah, this in terms of the exact context, I would need more context of what had happened. Like I know just basic stuff, but like more context would be appreciated to make arguments, which I can read about and then yeah come up with. There is a girl by the name of Jeannie Valley who's locked in a room by her father. She did not respond to stimuli. Sure, huh? I mean, an argument against it could be that against that analysis could be that it was beaten out of her and it did come naturally, rather than it never really coming up at all. Maybe by the end of it, yeah, maybe she had just resigned herself to whatever her fate was, but it's not something that she would have accepted at all stages, which is why it's and that's something that is hard to prove again, disprove at least, if that makes sense. But anyway, हाँ मैं उस blueprint पे आ जाता हूँ at least. I'll answer this Pranay Gupta wala question in a bit. The blueprint idea was simple. Okay, so I told you that how you work in how you argue a principle is give examples of like state your principle, give examples of situations in which it's upheld the same principle in society, compare why this is a similar situation, and finally explain why you have to uphold it in this particular scenario. Now, if that's the blueprint of arguing a principle, the blueprint of arguing against the principle would be to either break that link where you're comparing the analogy, like comparing this situation with those other situations in which it applies, meaning that if you can find some sort of reasons why those two situations are literally not the same thing based on context or based on some past wrongs or stuff like that, then you can basically explain why it doesn't, why that basically that principle, even if it's applied in those situations, this situation is literally a different thing, which is why it won't apply. The second way to argue against it is just to say that It's just to explain why, because if the burden for them is to explain why that principle should be upheld in this particular scenario, then you will try to argue why it should not be upheld in this particular scenario at all. So just to say that even if it's a good principle to have in society, it's okay to not emphasize it in this particular situation, because there are, for whatever outcomes you think is necessary, and that's usually where that clash lies of principles. Uh, अरे यार साहिल भटनागर क्यों है? Can I kick people out? I want to kick Sahil Bhatnagar out. Please, कोई सिखा दो. There has to be a way. Remove, hide user on this. I'll hide user. I'm hiding him. This user's messages will be hidden. Yes, good. Don't listen to Bhatnagar in general ever. Vasvi Khanna, is it right for us then not still being affected in that circumstance, just seeing that something is wrong and correcting it? Acha, wait, there's more. Okay, so like an elf whose ultimate purpose in life is being a slave and serving their masters, and we cannot take away their purpose of their lives, but we can see that what is happening to them is very wrong. You're talking about like Harry Potter, na? Is it right for us then to not still being affected in that circumstance, just seeing that something is wrong and correcting it? Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think a lot of people would argue against how it's right. But there is a debate again. It's the same thing, right? Then it's a stakeholder thing. If those people are right now not protesting, then why would you want to prioritize them? And the arguments would then be the same. See, understand this. I can't give you 5, 6 different ideas in every different motion and say that none of them can overlap ever. The point is that if you have certain ideas about like for example certain principles like empathy or like sovereignty or things that you want to value, it's about how you're able to flesh them out in that particular debate and how then it compares to the other side's analysis of why, for example, humans or their convenience through those slaves is something that should be prioritized, and how you're able to weigh those two things, which is why at the end of the day, if it's about wins the debate, that'll be the side that probably fleshed their arguments out better and was able to convince us. And this is the whole idea of saying, and this is why principles are also useful in debates. It's the kind of it's where you can basically pour as much rhetoric as you want to and try to influence based on just your words and your like dil ki feelings basically to basically any adjudicate, even the ones who are trying to be as rational as possible. Because the idea is just that the more you're able to convince people that what you're saying is more right or more justified, is when you win. So yeah, if you have a more consistent line as to why your principle cannot be compromised on, and give without an example, it's very tough to do that. Um, you will probably take it. But is it right for us then and not is a question that's up to you, because I mean you can literally defend both sides on that debate, because it's literally probably, yeah, I think I've seen a motion like that. So whether or not it's morally right, and this is what I think, starting with those joke questions, I don't know if sure I was serious about them, but these joke questions were just that only, that is there any moral truth or objective morality, and obviously I mean no, it's up to you based on what you think is right and wrong. Yeah. So and that's why in debates you can pick. Obviously, you can have preferences, but you will probably be asked to justify like different sides in different scenarios. Which is why this blueprint of how to argue a principle and how to argue against one is pretty useful. Um, how to yeah, that was okay. Questions ये तो हो गए. And morality in general, and yeah, this is the morality. I mean, and morality is just integrated into all of this when you're basically trying to uh, judge what is moral. And this is the kind of motion. For example, there was a motion that uh, I had once made. I mean, it might just be a bad one, but the motion I quite liked it. It was this idea of how, and this is the kind of debate which will necessarily be principled in nature because of the way it's worded. It was about how, as if humans, you've brought your own of if Earth is dying, basically, you know that it's dying, and the only way you can survive is to go to a different planet which you've located and you can go to, and then inhabit that planet. But you will interfere with an evolutionary process that is already occurring in that planet. So thus dooming that species which would come up in like a few which would come up in like a few what's it called, like billion years or whatever, and I don't know what the scale is, man, thousand, yeah, whatever, in a lot of years in that on that planet, you would interfere with that process, and then you would like basically colonize that place, and use it for, and the humans would survive basically, and then you can do whatever the fuck you want. You can like uh, go like live your lives and for the humanity or whatever. But that particular species would no longer exist, which in the absence of your intervention would have come up this in a probably in a similar way, ethically at least, to the way humans did on planet Earth. So the motion was this house believes that it's unethical to colonize ethos, ethos being the planet's name. So yeah, stuff like that will necessarily be principled, because then you it's all up in the air as to what unethical is, where do ethics come from, what values in like what value does ethics hold in general, why is it even relevant? And then once you've established what ethics are, why this particular move fits into those values and doesn't, and stuff like that. That's the entire debate. So motion like that is necessarily a principled one, which is why that basically screams principled. And regardless of whether or not you think it's a good one, I don't know if Sahil Bhatnagar is watching, or he'll criticize it definitely. But the idea is just this, that motions like that are ones that are necessarily more principled. If anyone knows how I can show a video, a YouTube video right now in the stream, then bata do. Otherwise, I'm pretty much done. You can ask me questions, abhi, huh, if I missed anything, because I might have missed a question or two in the middle. Otherwise, I want to show like one speech, and one part of the speech which displays everything, all the blueprint I said really well. But yeah, now I'm just waiting for questions. I think there's a lag between my speech and the thing. So yeah. Use your phone. It's the Bo CEO speech only. It's the this house believes that the global poor would be justified in pursuing a Marxist revolution. That speech, there's this somewhere between the first and second and a half minute or something like that. He does exactly what I've said right now, which is why and that's probably a line of argumentation that stood by the till the end of the debate, which is why those guys won. Would it be correct to say that principles come in when you're setting the metrics for utility? Or, in other words, that principled arguments are just utilitarian arguments with different metrics? Uh, yes, sort of. Yeah, sure. I mean, that's my understanding of what how principles work, at least in debates that have come to so far. If it changes, I will update all of you. But these are exact questions that I've asked many people and never got any answers to, and this is what I've come to at least realize so far. This idea that principled arguments aren't are if you're saying utilitarian arguments with different metrics, sure, because utilitarianism with different utilities is what basically any philosophy is, because then you prioritize certain different stakeholders, right? The only reason why every other philosophy is not called utilitarian is because the caveats are just way too many for you to just simply hand utilitarianism credit for all of them. The idea is just that you principles are what define which stakeholders are important and which ones you would probably want to prioritize, and what actions then like what actions that fulfill those purposes and stuff like that. Everything that I've said so far. The communism of my speech. Okay, I will try to play it from my phone because I literally do not know how to play it right now. But uh, huh. Any other questions? Let me know. Okay, I don't think this is a good idea. Just playing it like this. हाँ लिंक ही भेज देता हूँ. That's a better idea. Hmm. Wait, just give me a sec. Just give me 2 minutes. So till then, you can ask. I'm just finding the exact timestamp which is relevant. Till then, you can ask whatever questions you have. Yeah, Okay, I've put the link and the timestamp. If you guys can watch it, dekh lo. Just confirm some, like say yes if you saw it on the group and you're watching it right now. Then I'll wait for. If nobody's watching it, then I guess I'll just look at questions if there are any. But dekh rahe ho to I'll wait for 2 minutes and then we can discuss. It's a 2 minute excerpt of the speech. Once you guys have watched it, bata dena. Just say yes again. Watched, yes, watched, or something. Oh, has everyone else watched it? At least the four people who said, yeah, Ramneet, and Ishan. Yeah, guys, have you watched it? Ramneet, Ishan. I'm just waiting for you guys because you said yes, pehle bhi, so I don't want to leave you out. I don't know if everyone else is watching. Cool, cool. Okay, you guys said you have. So, uh, so here's the thing. Like again, that speech sounds amazing and everything, but at its core, what it's doing is the same thing, right? So what it's done is it stated its principle, which was that we want to preserve human dignity. Then he said that other situations in which we preserve human dignity is like theft, and when we punish people for theft and negligence. And then he explained exactly why, like if you guys remember, he explained exactly why this is theft or negligence. He gave examples, like he gave other examples, like theft and negligence are inherent examples as to why the like criminal examples in society that we uphold right now. And comparing this with an analogy as to why this is the same thing is the entire idea of why capital was unjustly acquired from them to begin with, like slavery, colonization, patriarchy, stuff like that, or negligence where you now had like entry barriers to like good educational institutes or and stuff like that to actually then be able to re-equip yourself in this new world to actually gain capital. Also things like capital decides who it goes to, stuff like that. I think I don't know if that was in this speech, but it's in the next or something. So those things are them explaining exactly why him explaining uh, why this is the same thing, and the only step left now is why it should be upheld in this particular instance, which is to say, even if so why can't the other side just compensate that even if we agree with that principle, it shouldn't be applied in this situation because of certain bad outcomes. What he said was, was that they, and this is what I meant by when you use a principle to establish how much damage has been done and how much someone is owed, or how much a magnitude of the task that needs to be done is really. He says that right now, whatever concessions that you can give in the existing capitalist structure are not enough for the historic oppression that they've been exposed to or whatever, which is why nothing you do in terms of right now, in terms of all the structures present right now, can ever compensate for that. Which is why the only way in which they can ever get any redressal to what they needed, to proportional to exactly what they need, and with something that can hopefully justify all the oppression that they've been put under, is a complete Marxist revolution and nothing short of that. And if you watch the entire debate, you realize that in my opinion, the final adjudication does weigh in that way that the principal clash that became this debate was that even if you have bad outcomes from this Marxist revolution, you would probably still pass the motion, and that's also inherently linked with how this motion was worded, and which made this a clear example of an explicitly principled motion. This house believes that it is justified for the poor to do that, not that this house as the poor believes that the poor should do this. The idea is just that you explained exactly what is principally justified. And so by the end, in the second speech, their argumentation is literally that even if it fails, it's still justified. Even if they get like really screwed afterwards through this revolution, it's still justified because of all of this. And if this has made sense so far, then and yeah, that's what Shaurya just wrote is what the member of opposition in that speech says to do, like have a diagonal clash. When asked a POI, he's like, because they were only arguing consequences, and they literally like the poor of this world will not care about your principled victory and stuff. But the fact that they were able to prove so well across their first two speeches in OG that that regardless of bad outcomes, this is exactly what is needed, and nothing short of this can ever suffice principally. If no other side, none of the opposing sides were ever able to clash with that principle took this debate for them, given how it was worded and how, yeah, like how well they did it. But it's a very good example of exactly what I said, which is why it's not an easy thing to do, yeah, but it's, and you can make it sound as beautiful as you want as he did because it just speaks really well. But the idea is just that you have to do these particular things. And yeah, so I hope that made sense. I hope you liked that speech also, because that's one of the most memed speeches ever as well. As uska intro, like its intro is also amazing. You should watch the entire speech in my opinion. And then remember, the second speech is also really good. Just watch the entire debate if you have the time. So, but yeah, questions. But did this make sense? What I said about how it fit into this blueprint? I mean, you can say yes or no. Otherwise, I'm just waiting for questions. Otherwise, if no one says anything, I'll just end because that's done from my side. So up to you guys now. Yeah, sure, sure. Right now, it might seem a bit of an assertion, but their entire analysis is basically going to prove why nothing that can be done right now is ever can never be enough as a redressal. Basically, like if you, I think, but if you listen to both the speeches, you'll be convinced of that principle to a certain extent. Yeah. So yeah, I hope this was useful. And unless you have guys have any questions, or you can just ask on chat, like just WhatsApp me as well. You lamba ke diya, and I think I also need to cook dinner now, so I might want to leave. So yeah, up to you. Unless you have some really pressing questions, we can end this now. Bolo, just say yes, it's okay, and or like yeah, thanks or whatever. No thanks, whatever. Just say something to make me end it, or just ask a question. Cool, है ना? चलो, nice. Thanks. I hope it helped, and see ya.